Could another civil war right here in the United States trigger the next economic collapse? The short answer, unfortunately, is yes. I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over some U.S. history. I'm a firm believer that in order to predict the future or to understand what may happen in the future, we have to understand what has already happened in the past. We're going to look at the past through the lens of a book called The Fourth Turning, co-authored by Neil Howe. We're going to get some clips from interviews with Neil in just a moment. Well, let's start off by going back to the 1770s and the 1780s, the time during the Revolutionary War. Divisiveness in the United States between Americans was extremely high. Many historians believe that this was a high point in divisiveness, along with the 1850s, 1930s, and today. The 2 groups that were competing back and forth were the Loyalists, the Tories. They were loyal to Britain. And it's represented by this individual right here that looks oddly enough like your friend and family member Fred. And he is holding a sign saying, "I love the Queen." And they were battling back and forth with this guy called Patriot Paul. So it was the Tories and the Patriots. And Paul has got himself one of those raccoon-looking hats, and he is really pissed off. He's got a sign that says, "Live free or die." And if you get into the nitty-gritty of their positions, it really boils down to one word, very similar to what we're seeing today. The Tories prioritized safety. They wanted to stay with Britain because they had the largest navy and they could offer them protection. But the Patriots saw it much different. They didn't want the safety. They didn't want the protection because they saw it as tyranny. They wanted freedom. More on that in just a moment. But you'll notice I've got Civil War right here when I'm referring to the 1770s and 1780s. Why is that? Because when you go through the diaries of a lot of Americans during that time, they actually referred to the Revolutionary War as the Civil War. Because Americans were so divided, they were really fighting among themselves. This led to extreme violence and actual terrorist attacks where Americans would attack brutally and violently other Americans that didn't have their same belief system. Another thing I found very interesting was after the war, in the mid-1780s and into the 1790s, U.S. society as a whole became far more agrarian, meaning that people moved out of the cities. They started producing their own food. They became even more self-sufficient. Does that sound familiar? But to dive into the details of what actually happened, let's go right to a clip from Real Vision where they interviewed demographer, historian, and author of The Fourth Turning, Neil Howe.
This is an incredible degree of polarization. I think the last time we saw that, again, this comes back to this whole fourth turning, right? But the last time we saw that, I think, was in the later years of the Herbert Hoover administration and the early 1930s. Of course, that was with the Depression coming down. And then before that was probably in the late 1850s. And that was more of a real sectional division. And we saw everything in America separating, including the parties ultimately, separating, you had a kind of a northern Whig and a southern Whig and a northern Democrat and a southern, everything split. All the churches split, all of the national organizations split, everything split, north and south, the 1770s. That was another period. And this is something people don't realize. The American Revolution at the time, if you look at letters and diaries and so on, people talking about what was happening, They really said revolution. Yeah, they said revolution when they referred to it as what we're, the whole thing with Britain. But among themselves, they used the word civil war, right?
Right.
It was a civil war within America. There was a large Tory contingent, a pro-British contingent in North America. Enormous tensions, right? Huge strains in America at the time, and terrorism employed throughout. I think originally more in the North, and in the later years, in the early 1780s, in the southern states, just extraordinarily bloody and cruel guerrilla campaigns, particularly in the backcountry. It was a very bad time.
So this extreme divisiveness led to effectively a civil war right here in the United States in the 1770s and 1780s. And it was highlighted by extreme violence, terrorist attacks, guerrilla warfare between the Tory Tims and the Patriot Pauls. And then, of course, in the 1850s, we saw the same levels of extreme divisiveness again, which led to another civil war. Then in the 1930s, we saw global divisiveness, a huge gap between the rich and the poor caused by the Depression, and going back to hyperinflation in Germany, among many other things. But the extreme divisiveness globally there, if you will, led to a world war. So the question becomes, what will we see today? According to the Fourth Turning and Neil Howe, we have the same levels of extreme divisiveness that we saw in the 1770s, 1850s, and 1930s. Each time leading to a war. In the first two cases, leading to a civil war. Step number 2. Now, let's take a deep dive into today's extreme divisiveness. The same levels of divisiveness, according to Neil Howe, that we saw in the 1770s and 1850s and the 1930s, all of which led to war. The first thing I want to point out, housing prices, or rents in this case, and food prices. If there is one thing that we have seen throughout history that bring people into the streets with pitchforks and torches, not just in the United States, but everywhere, it's the cost of housing going up, and maybe even more importantly, the cost of food going up. People can accept a lot in their daily lives. They can accept crazy politicians and governments. They can accept some level of restriction. In fact, they can accept a lot of restriction, which is what we saw in 2020 all around the globe. But the one thing they cannot accept, the straw that always breaks the camel's back, is when they can't afford to put food on the table. So let's start with this chart going back to 2018 all the way to 2021. On the left, nominal rents, we go from $1,000 up to $1,300. And this chart, I didn't really draw this very well, so the editor will throw up the real chart as a reference point. But the trend line is going up, but it's going up very gradually. And we see the actual rents, which are indicated by the blue line. They've gone up, they go down a little bit, they go back up, go down, kind of this wavy pattern gradually going up. But in 2020 or the end of 2019, they start to go down. But in 2021, they go parabolic to a point now where they're far higher than the historic trend line. And there's no indication that they're going down anytime soon. And you contrast this to home prices, and home prices are going up even faster. So the bottom line is the cost of housing for the average American right now is higher than it has ever been. This creates a massive amount of stress throughout society, which exacerbates the emotion involved in the divisiveness we already have. Second chart, food price index, 2017 all the way to 2021. On the left, we go from 90 to 135. And it kind of just trends right around 90, goes up a little bit in 2018, then in 2020. And just like we saw rent prices go parabolic, food prices have gone straight up as well in 2021 to a point where they're nearly, or maybe even more than 30% higher than they were just a year ago. Let that sink in for a moment. The average Joe and Jane is paying 30% plus more for their food and almost that much more for their housing costs. At a certain point, that's going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back. That will lead to more social unrest, civil unrest, and people going to the streets with the torches and pitchforks. But let's focus more on the divisiveness between all Americans right now. It's at a fever pitch. So we understand this powder keg of emotion is really fueling the divisiveness, the extreme divisiveness that we have in the United States. Let's go over a list of just some of the things that are dividing Americans right now. And I think you'll quickly understand the gravity of the situation we are currently in. Starts with blue and red, Democrats, Republicans. It's kind of a no-brainer. We've seen this tribalism get more and more severe over the past, call it decade or even 5 years, to the point where we saw it breaking out in violence in 2020. We've got this side, a lot of them are in favor of censorship. On this side, we've got the people who oppose that. They're in favor of free speech. We've got the Black Lives Matter. We've got Blue Lives Matter. We've got Antifa. And on this side, we've got the Trump supporters. On this side, we've got the woke crowd. On this side, anti-woke, the opposite of that. I want to point out that you can have people that are Republicans that believe a few things on this side, and maybe some Democrats that believe a few things on this side, especially when it comes to the, can't really say it for YouTube, we'll call them the current medicines that we are seeing or being encouraged to take from governments and the mainstream media. You've got a lot of Democrats that are very, let's just say, anti this new form of medicine. And we've got a lot of Republicans that are pro this new form of medicine, maybe even pro mandates from the government. But let's go back to the list here. We've got the woke crowd, the anti-woke, the people who favor this new medicine, let's say, and the people who do not like this new form of medicine. We've got the people who favor mandates from the government. We have people who are anti-mandate from the government. Just in New York City, San Francisco, and New Orleans, we've seen that the government is forcing businesses. They're making it illegal for businesses to serve certain groups of the American population. The exact same thing that we saw during the Jim Crow days. Now, I realize that it's two different things. People can't control the color of their skin. But that argument, I think, is too myopic. You're not seeing the bigger picture. That is looking at the relationship between the business and the customer. What I think you need to do is look at the relationship between the government and the business, where the government is saying it is literally illegal for businesses to serve groups of Americans in the population, and large groups of Americans. Again, very similar to the Jim Crow laws that we have seen in the past. And then on this side, we also have a lot of people out there right now that prioritize safety over freedom. And on the other side, it's the complete opposite. Those people value freedom more than they value safety. So my main point is I don't think it's outrageous to suggest we have the same levels of divisiveness, if not more divisiveness, today than we saw in the 1770s and the 1850s, which led to effectively a civil war. And I want to be very clear that when I'm talking about a civil war today in the United States, I'm not talking about groups of Americans with guns coming out to a battlefield or with tanks or missiles or anything like that. What I'm really referring to is this extreme violence, the terrorist attacks, Americans against other Americans with different belief systems. This type of guerrilla warfare that Neil Howe talked about in the 1770s and 1780s. Very similar to what we saw in 2020 and a little bit in 2021. I just think it gets worse and worse and worse and worse. I want to be very clear. There are no certainties. There are only probabilities. What I'm saying is I think the probability is high we go this direction in the United States, but you've got to figure out the probabilities for yourself. So the next question becomes, okay, if we do go into this quote unquote civil war, will that lead to an economic collapse? And to answer that question, we've got to do the exact same thing we did in step number 1 and go back and look at history. Step number 3, the economic history of the United States and divisiveness. And you notice I focus on this instead of the Civil War because I think this is a precursor that almost always inevitably leads to the Civil War itself. So let's start by looking at a chart of per capita income. And unfortunately, we don't have great numbers going back to the 1700s to measure GDP, but this is pretty much as good as we can get here. So it starts with 1700, goes all the way to the year 1800. I think the chart I use goes a little bit further, but this does the job. On the left, we go from $100 up to $240. I'm assuming this is, I don't know if this is per year or per month. I don't know which it is, but it gives us a percentage of increase or decrease. So from 17, we'll call it 70, to the mid 1780s, as measured by this chart, per capita income went down by about 20%. And I'd also like to point out, Neil Howe says that this is a time in the United States where we had massive de-urbanization, something that we're seeing happen right now, right in front of our eyes in 2020 and 2021. And you have to ask yourself, if the violence, if the craziness, if the insanity got even worse in the future, don't you think more and more people would move out to the country? I think that's a pretty good bet. And also, we've got to realize that although we do have the internet today, this de-urbanization process most likely would not bode well for the creation of goods and services. We as a society would get poorer, and it most likely would be reflected in GDP, nominal GDP, going down. This is a chart of the 1930s. And I bring this up because Neil Howe points out that in his opinion, and all the research that he has done, he thinks that GDP in the 1770s going into the 1780s went down to a greater degree than we even saw it go down during the Great Depression. So this chart from 1930 to 1938, on the left, we go from 760 billion up to over $1 trillion when they use, I think it was 2009 dollars. So this is real GDP. Bottom line here is it goes down by over 30% in just the span of a few years. So let's think this through. In the first Civil War we had in the United States, per capita income goes down by 20%, according to this chart, but GDP could have gone down by even more than 30%. Just mind-boggling numbers. To understand this even better, let's go right back to the Real Vision interview.
The most recent economic research we have now shows that that period from the late 1770s through to about the mid 1790s was probably one of the biggest economic contractions in American history, probably larger than what happened even in the 1930s. We became a significantly more agrarian republic by the time of John Adams' presidency and the time that Jefferson took over. We kind of de-urbanized. I mean, it was traumatic, and then we recovered, right?
Now I want to focus on what nominal GDP did during or after the Civil War. We have a data set that we can see. Editor will go ahead and throw that up. It shows that nominal GDP went down by 5.9% as a 3-year average. So over a 3-year span after the Civil War, on average, nominal GDP went down by almost 6%. But let's look at the real GDP number. It was almost flat at a positive 0.3%. And I focused on nominal GDP for a reason, because I want to make a very, very important point. Let's think about how real GDP is measured. That's when it's adjusted for the rate of inflation. We can have a 5% nominal increase in GDP and 5% inflation. That gives us a real GDP growth of 0%. But we can have a negative 5% nominal GDP and a negative 5% inflation. In other words, 5% price deflation, and we still get to the same real GDP growth number of 0%. But all real GDP growth numbers are not created equal. This 0% today would be far, far, far different than this 0%. And what I want to highlight right now is when we look at the GDP decline in the first Civil War and the GDP decline as a result of the second Civil War, it's where nominal GDP goes down significantly. So I know a lot of you right now are kind of scratching your head and saying, okay, George, I get it, but who cares? Why does that matter to me living in the United States today? Good question. Here's why that's important. Here is a chart that I just made up right off the top of my head. And this illustrates what might happen if we saw 50% deflation and we saw GDP go down by 50%. So again, real GDP would be at 0%. So what would happen? Let's just assume that you started with $4,000 of income. Your income goes down to $2,000 a month. But the prices of goods and services gets cut in half as well. So on net balance, that really wouldn't affect your purchasing power. But today, we have consumer debt or private sector debt at all-time highs. We have corporate debt at all-time highs. We have government federal debt to GDP at all-time highs. So let's rewind a little bit and go back to this chart. Assuming you had zero debt, 50% deflation or 50% decrease in nominal GDP at the same time, so 0% real GDP growth in this scenario really wouldn't affect your quality of life. But if you started off with a lot of debt, now you've got huge, huge problems because your debt payment is in nominal terms. That doesn't change. So let's just say you started with a mortgage payment of $2,000. Well, in 5 years or 10 years, however long it takes us to realize these numbers we're referring to, your income goes down to $2,000, but your debt payment, your mortgage payment, does not go down by 50%. It's still $2,000. So here you start with a situation where you have $2,000 in addition to your mortgage payment or after you pay your mortgage payment. Here you're in a situation where you have $0 left after you pay your mortgage to buy goods and services such as food and shelter. So the main takeaway from that thought experiment is if we had a civil war in the United States that only led to 0% real GDP growth, but we had a huge decrease in nominal GDP like we saw during the First and Second Civil War in the United States, that would have a much, much, much bigger impact on the standard of living today than it did back in the 1800s or the 1700s. It would almost definitely lead to an economic collapse like we have never seen in this country before. So the idea of the United States going into another civil war, I know sounds incredibly extreme. As a matter of fact, it's even weird to kind of say it out loud. And I want to be clear that I'm not talking about different groups of Americans going to a battlefield with tanks and missiles or machine guns, anything like that. What I'm thinking about is a civil war that, like the 1770s, when Americans were fighting Americans, it's more of these kind of guerrilla type warfare where people are, who knows, lighting off bombs or hitting each other with cars at some sort of protest rally, something like this that keeps getting more and more and more severe. Everyone in the financial space, the media, and on FinTwit is trying to figure out what the next black swan event may be for the stock market, the housing market, or the economy in general. And I think that this black swan is something that everybody is missing. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.